This next session is Any Questions with Dr. Steve Davies. Now, for those of you who don't know him, and I'm sure most of you do, he has worked for a number of organizations in the United States and has also been a lecturer in economic history at Manchester Metropolitan University. Very importantly, he is also head of education at the Institute of Economic Affairs and does the academic content for all of our student programs. So I'm sure a number of you have come across him if you've ever interned with us. And if you haven't, then do make sure you apply for an internship. The way this is going to work is we've got lots of questions that people have submitted to us via Twitter and email, so thank you very much. I'm afraid we're probably not going to have time to ask all of them, but we'll do our best, and I'm also going to come to the audience to ask a few questions as well. But just to kick us off, the first question I wanted to put to Steve is how inevitable do you think a financial crash is now, and why?
Well, I don't think a financial crash is inevitable, but I think that the chances of one happening in the near future, next couple of years, is much higher than I would like it to be. The reason is that, well, the short reason is that we did not sort out the problems that led to the previous financial crash in 2008. Instead, the policy response of governments and central banks around the world was to try and avoid an asset price correction at almost any cost, which they, so as a result, they pumped up the world's supply of money massively through QE and other such programs. And I think that was actually a huge mistake. I can understand why they did it, but I think it was still a mistake. Now, if you look at the longer perspective, since certainly 1997, maybe even as far back as 1987, we've had an increasingly unorthodox and loose monetary policy followed by the world's central banks. And throughout the whole of that very long period now, interest rates have, for prolonged periods of time, been held well below their natural rate, the Vixelian natural rate of interest. And the result of this has been progressively larger and larger amounts of malinvestment. Lots of assets are now mispriced because risk has been mispriced. Lots and lots of investments have been made on the basis of false signals of profitability, which are actually fundamentally not profitable. And also a lot of future growth has been assumed, which for various reasons is not going to happen. And what this means is that there's a bigger and bigger build-up of misallocated resources. And you can look at this phenomenon and you say, well, this can't go on forever. This is Herbert Stein's famous law. He was Richard Nixon's chief economic advisor, and he said, well, if something can't go on forever, then it won't. This is known as Stein's law. The trouble is that even when you can say something can't go on forever, it can still go on for a really, really long time. And so I think that the chances of a financial crisis are actually significant. I wouldn't say they're better than even money, but they're still very significant. We've had warning signs very recently, such as the two big Italian banks being bailed out earlier on this week. The Bank of England and other central banks are now seriously worried about the amount of bad credit in the car purchase market, for example. And to put that into some idea of the size, the total amount of credit advanced to buy cars in the United States is $1.1 trillion. So we're talking about a very large amount of advanced credit here. But on the other hand, it could well be that this doesn't happen. We just stagger on as we are, which in some ways is actually a worse prospect than a financial crisis, because it means that we aren't going to resolve that fundamental misallocation of resources that's been brought about by 30 years of excessively loose monetary policy. Sorting that out will be very, very difficult and painful. I think that's what we should have done in 2008. But for understandable reasons, we didn't, which means that we still have those problems that caused the crash back then.
Thank you. So the next question, actually a few of you were asking very similar questions, so I've sort of combined it into one. But it's, what do you think of GDP as a measure of growth? Should economic growth be the main objective? Or should we prioritize happiness? And what other methods of measurement are out there?
Yeah. GDP has all kinds of problems as a unit of economic measurement, and economists are well aware of that. They've been aware of this ever since the concept was created by Simon Kuznets, I believe it was, back in the interwar years. The problem with GDP is it only measures basically economic transactions. So there's all kinds of wealth-creating activity, such as activity that doesn't involve the use of money, which it simply doesn't capture. Now, with having said that, it's probably the best measure we have available to us for measuring general levels of economic output, economic activity, productivity and production and the like. But it's becoming increasingly inaccurate because of the growth of technologies like the ones that Jared was talking about, which means that in the future, with the sharing economy, we're going to get by with a lot less material stuff than we did in the past. Because we will not need anywhere near as much physical products. And that means that GDP will be showing stagnant or even declining growth, but when in fact, economic well-being, which is what you're really interested in, has gone up because people are getting services much, much more cheaply or much more efficiently and at lower cost. So I think that although it's probably the best guide we have, it is becoming increasingly dubious, and we've got to be much more skeptical than we are perhaps about how to use it. Should we make happiness the main guide? I think that's a very difficult question. I don't think we should do that, actually, simply because it's so difficult to measure happiness. If you ask people around the world, are you happy on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 means, my God, I'm in ecstasy, it can't get any better, and nil means, bring me a suicide kit right now. Pretty much everybody always puts 7. And the reason is quite obvious when you think about it. Nobody wants to admit that they're utterly miserable, unless you're a Hungarian, apparently. Hungary is one of the few countries which has a lower score. But on the other hand, nobody wants to admit that, you're as happy as you could possibly be, because that's like, it's downhill from now on if that's true. So that kind of survey is not actually very useful, I think. And so it's all very well to say, you want people to be happy. I think everyone does. But making happiness itself the target, I think, is a mistake. What you should do is target other things that we know are going to make people more happy rather than not, such as material well-being, peace and safety, good health, all that kind of thing.
Thank you. I think I know what your answer might be to this next one, but should there be a maximum limit to the salaries that people can earn?
No, and I think pretty much every economist on the planet would give that answer. The general rule is that putting price caps or ceilings on any kind of market is going to have pretty disastrous results. I know, though, why people do ask this question. It's because of the apparently enormous rewards given to senior managers in large publicly quoted companies and the like. Worth saying, by the way, that the British public's view of this is actually quite nuanced, because they don't appear to mind very high rewards and salaries going to entrepreneurs, but they are a bit vexed when they go to people like the chairman of a stock exchange, FTSE 100 company. I think there's actually something in that insight. I think they're onto something, which is that until the 1980s, we tended to think of the senior managers of large companies as being functionaries. Their job was to run an institution. And as such, their pay was set ultimately by productivity. It was determined by the productivity of the work they did. Since the 1980s, we've tended to think of the chairman of large companies as being entrepreneurs. And the market for entrepreneurs is a completely different kind of market. It's a winner-takes-all market in which a very small number of people get enormously high rewards. It's a star market, similar to the market for high-performance court lawyers, footballers or other sports stars, people in the entertainment business. Those are all a different kind of labour market. Now, the question is, therefore, would you cap that? And I think the answer is no, you wouldn't, because there are some people, some footballers, some stars who make a real difference. And those people are worth every penny they get. The problem is it's very hard to find out who they are. And that's why you tend to get some people getting paid a lot more than you might think they deserve, like Wayne Rooney, for example. So my answer is no, you should not do that. But what you might think about doing is reassessing the way we view or understand the role of the chairman of a large corporation. Maybe we ought to row back a bit on the entrepreneurial view of what they're doing and go back a bit toward the idea that just a well-paid manager whose job is to keep the show on the road.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask one more question from here, then I'll ask a few from the floor, and then I'll come back. So the last question from here for the moment is, how would Hayek and/or similar thinkers have reacted to the response of the Eurozone in the context of Draghi's vast QE program, quantitative easing, and the austerity and internal devaluation of the Eurozone nations to the euro crisis? That's
a very easy question to answer. They would have reacted the way pretty much every economist, regardless of their ideology or philosophy, has reacted. One of the things you should do is to look at what happened when the Maastricht Treaty was being agreed and the euro was being designed and set up. pretty much every single economist on the planet said that it was a bad idea. And they all said it was a bad idea for the same reasons, and they all predicted exactly what has come to pass. In the same week, in that year, Milton Friedman gave a television interview in which he was asked about the euro, and Paul Krugman wrote a column in the New York Times about the euro. If you look at the transcript of Friedman's interview and read Krugman's column, it's very hard to tell them apart. They're both saying exactly the same thing. Do not do this. It's a really bad idea. So basically, everything the economists expected to happen when you create a single monetary system without a political union to underpin it has come to pass. What would they advise to do? Don't do what they've done. Because the kind of austerity that's been enforced on Greece, for example, has actually just made things worse. Greece has had the biggest decline in national GDP of any country ever. It's even bigger than many countries went through in the Great Depression. And that simply is not going to resolve the problem. What they should do is allow Greece, or actually force Greece, to leave the euro. And they should think very seriously either about dismantling the eurozone or about creating what they should have had in place in the first place, which is a proper kind of European federal government that can underpin and support the currency union. And I don't think it's peculiar to Hayek. I think pretty much any economist of any persuasion would say exactly the same thing.
Great. Thank you. So questions from the floor. Put your hands up high. Okay. There's someone there in the middle. And then who's got the microphones? Great. Thank you. Just there? Yeah.
Hello. In terms of that question about the maximum salary, in 2013, the Switzerland decided to against the huge income inequality, and but it's been rejected by the voters. And do you think that the maximum salary for those executives is a good way to solve the income inequality, like a relative salaries for those who earn the least and the people who earn the most?
No, I don't. Now, there are two things to say here. The first is the point that Mark Littlewood made in the first talk today, which is that you can be seriously relaxed about very high salaries and even big gaps between the top paid earners and the lowest paid earners, so long as, in some sense, everybody is better off. If people at the top are getting high salaries at the expense of people down at the bottom who are getting less or lower, then that's problematic, obviously. But the evidence is that that's not what is happening. So you can only be bothered about that if you are a first principles egalitarian, if you think that for moral or some other reason, there's something inherently problematic or wrong about having a big gap between high pay and low pay. And I agree with Mark, I don't think there is. Having said that, the other thing is this. The thing which ultimately determines the level of pay for virtually everyone, except for special categories of people, is their marginal productivity. That's one of the basic insights of economics. You are basically paid what the value of each additional unit of your work is. Sometimes there will be cases where companies can get away with paying you a bit less than that. There might be other cases where you get a bit more than that. But those are marginal cases. Normally, that's what determines pay. Now, the thing with really high salaries at the top, which are exceptional, is, as I said in my answer, that's because those salaries are increasingly set through what you might call a star market. And that's a market which is more like a gambling market, because take the case of footballers, for example. You know as a fact that there are certain special footballers out there who make a real difference between winning a trophy and not winning a trophy, for example. They're worth an incredible amount of money. The trouble is you don't know for sure who they are. So you have to basically gamble. You have to punt on a whole lot of players and hope that one of them is someone like Cristiano Ronaldo, who's going to do the business for you. And that kind of market is always a winner-takes-all market in which a small number of people get very high salaries. The only way you can avoid that happening is if you don't have that kind of market. That's why I indicated that maybe in large public companies, we ought to rethink what we think the role of the chief executive is. Maybe Jack Welch is wrong, and we don't want our chief executive officer to be a freewheeling entrepreneur. We just want him to be a very well-paid and efficient functionary who keeps General Electric or whatever it is on the road. But there's always going to be a significant gap. And as far as the really big gaps that we've begun to see opening up in a number of countries in the last 20, 30 years, I think the question there, as I said, is do you want to have a certain kind of market for senior executive talents, in which case you've got to accept these very high wage pays for them, or do you think we should go back to the kind of market that they still have in Japan, for example, where you're paid pretty much like any other, it's a market which is similar to that for all other kinds of employee, where it's done on the basis of marginal productivity. But in addition, I'm quite relaxed about very high pay differentials, as long as the people at the bottom are also getting better off.
Thank you. So I'm going to take two more questions together this time. Anyone in the balcony want to ask a question? There's someone over there. And then down here, I'll take this person at the front, please.
Steve, you were saying earlier that on the whole, not just Britain, but the whole world's gone richer. That's true. But with Britain, you've got millions of people who are left behind economically, post-industrial areas, have lost their traditional industries, have poorly paid part-time service jobs. So whilst it's true that on the whole we're richer, there are millions of people that are left behind. So how do you give that sort of positive message to people who aren't feeling that sort of broader wealth?
Well, there are two responses to that. The first is that in the longer run, as Mark was saying this morning, the people who are at the back of the queue, if you will, are still moving up in terms of living standards. The more serious problem that I think is captured by that is not so much that there are people in low productivity industries or parts of the world, because, as I say, you would generally expect that they're going to become higher productivity and therefore better off. It's people who are displaced by economic change. That's the more serious challenge, it seems to me. Because what you have in many cases is cases where people who have acquired skills and made a good living out of working in a particular kind of industry or economic activity suddenly find that because of technological change or changes in the pattern of world demand or something over which they have no control, that their skills are no longer worth a lot. And they suddenly suffer, that they then feel that they're being cut out of it. Now, the economist's answer, I'm afraid, is rather inadequate, because the economist's answer is, well, society as a whole is still better off, and you're going to be better off in the long run, so suck it up. And quite frankly, I freely say that is not a satisfactory answer, really, because the long run can be, it's no good saying to somebody, well, you've had a big drop in your standard of living, maybe your town has lost its main economic function, but don't worry, in 10 or 15 years' time, everything is going to be fine. That's not very satisfying. And so I think thinking of it that way helps us to realize what the real problem or challenge is. And the challenge really is to manage the transitional costs of economic change and development. And I have to say that I think both the state and the private sector are not dealing with that very well right now. So I freely say that there is a challenge for all of us to think of ways of doing that, improving that. I think the answer ultimately is better institutional design in various ways. Different kinds of education, for example, different kinds of maybe financial system or financial architecture, which will make it easier for parts of the world that are affected by rapid change of that kind to adjust more rapidly and with less transitional cost, which is a nice euphemism for lots of people going through periods of unemployment or poverty.
Thank you. And this gentleman at the front.
Hi, so it's been quite a few years since Hayek posited the possibility of denationalised currencies. I was wondering, with the rise of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and Ether, how likely you think a total denationalisation of currencies would be and what economic impacts that would have?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch it. You want to know what do I think the economic impact of nationalising utilities or something like that would be?
Denationalising currencies, like
Denationalised currencies.
Sorry?
Denationalised currencies and Bitcoin.
Oh, right, denationalising of the money system. Okay. I honestly don't know what effect that would have, because this is something completely unknown, really. So almost by definition, it's unforeseeable what the results of taking the issuing of currency away from national governments would be like. Whether this is likely to happen is also a tricky question, because I think at the moment there are huge advantages to governments being governments, I should say, hold a lot of cards in terms of being the people who are the existing issuers of currency. It's a big switch for most users of currency to switch from national currencies to non-national ones. So I'm not one of those people who thinks that we are on the verge of a sudden revolutionary collapse of national currencies and the rise of cryptocurrencies. I think the existing system has a lot of inertia. What would happen if suddenly they were to collapse, which might happen if they were mad enough to try and ban cash? As you may know, governments are very keen at the moment, or toying with the idea of banning cash completely, which is an outrageous idea in my view. If they do that, then I think suddenly there would be an explosive growth of non-national based monies, cryptocurrencies and the like. But I think that absent that, it's not likely to happen on a big scale anytime soon, for various reasons.
Okay, so next question, a very important topic and something we're touching upon later this afternoon as well. But will automation create massive job loss in low-wage countries? And if so, what can those countries realistically do to prevent themselves slipping further into poverty?
The answer is no. It's not going to cause job losses in low-wage countries for the simple reason that you're only going to invest in even quite low-cost artificial intelligence algorithms or robots if they are cheaper than the alternative of using human labor. So in parts of the world where wages are relatively low at the moment, the immediate impact of automation is going to be less. The place where we're going to see the big impact of automation, artificial intelligence and the like, is in high-pay parts of the world, developed countries like the UK. And also the bulk of the impact is going to come on white-collar, middle-class professions. Quite a few studies done recently about the likely impact of automation on which jobs are at high risk, which are not. At one end of the scale, the OECD reckons about 9 to 10% of jobs are at high risk of automation. The other more common perception is that about between 45 to 60% of jobs are at high risk. And the kind of jobs that are regarded as almost certain to be automated are things like legal secretary, loan originator, lot of jobs in the financial services industry, lot of legal jobs, most solicitors, for example, lot of medical jobs, most GPs, that kind of thing, probably done by an algorithm rather than a human being in a few years' time, probably with a better bedside manner. So I think that actually the impact of automation on low-wage developing countries is likely to be much less than the impact on high-wage countries. That's where you're going to see the major effect, I think.
Thank you. Do you agree that we each in wealthy countries have a moral obligation to donate significant amount of money to the global poor?
There's an interesting question there. Unwrap that a bit. What that is, the question that's behind that is the question of whether or not you have a moral duty to assist the less fortunate. Never mind whether they're in another part of the world or not. The generic question is, does the fact that some people are significantly worse off than you imply that you have some kind of moral duty to assist or help those people? And you can then have arguments about whether it's what they call a perfect duty or an imperfect duty. I think, yes, there is an obligation of that kind. I think there is a moral duty on those who are fortunate, and it's important to emphasize the part that luck plays in this, the luck of being born in a certain time and place, for example, to assist those who don't share that good fortune. But then the second question is, how should you do this? And I think this is where economics, in fact, becomes very, very useful as a subject, because what it tells you is the best way to, in fact, make the poor better off. That is what economists have been mainly concerned with ever since the whole discipline first appeared in the 18th century. And what that tells you is that, whether it's in your own country or in other countries, large-scale transfers of income are not the most efficient way of doing that. What you want to do is to remove things that preserve and protect privileges on the part of the better off, and also to create the institutional and other frameworks which enable the process of economic growth to have its best effects, the effects that Mark was talking about, and to improve the conditions of the least well off. Now, that can have some very radical implications, by the way. One of the very clear messages of economics is that one of the most certain ways that you can improve the well-being of the poorest people on the planet is to have freer immigration. The evidence is absolutely categorical in that respect, that if you want to make the really poor people in the world better off, one of the things you should definitely be advocating is much freer movement of labour around the world. And that would have a huge effect in that regard.
Well, this actually brings me very nicely on to our next question, which is, what are your views on controlled immigration and higher government surveillance in order to limit terrorism? When does it infringe upon our personal liberty?
I don't think either of those are what benefits, a significant benefit in combating terrorism, quite honestly. As far as the surveillance goes, I don't think there's a real need for any new laws. We already have laws in place which have been in place for literally hundreds of years, which give the public authorities the power to intercept the mail, which by extension means email and other communications, of people where it is strongly suspected there are good reasons for thinking that they are engaged in the commission of or are planning the commission of a serious crime or offence. That's been true since the 16th century. And that is a power that the state has, and it's a power I think it's appropriate to use in cases like this. The idea that the state should simply look at everybody's email or everybody's electronic communications, I think is self-defeating, because you're already dealing, as far as the security services are concerned, with the problem of trying to find the proverbial needle in the haystack. Why on earth are you then going to make the haystack 10 times bigger by intercepting or checking every single item of electronic communication? The reason for wanting to do this, actually, is to make ex post facto investigation of terrorist outrages easier. It's not to prevent them, although it's spun that way. It's more about, say a terrorist outrage has happened, how you then investigate it. And if you then have all that data out there, but you know where to start, because you now know the identity of the person who's blown themselves up, then you can go and start looking. My own view is that it's not necessary to have such wide and intrusive surveillance of people's communications to do that. What you need is just good old-fashioned intelligence work. As to controlling movement, I don't think that is a particularly significant factor here. The major terrorist threat in countries at the moment comes from people who are actually born here, first or second generation people. Worth saying, by the way, that historically there are two kinds of terrorism. We've had terrorism since the 1860s as a modern phenomenon. And there are two kinds of terrorists. There are ones like, say, the IRA or ETA, the Basque terrorist group, who have clear political goals, and you can actually negotiate with people like that. On the other hand, there's the kind of terrorists that you see with IS, for example. They're more like anarchist terrorists from the late 19th century, or some of the far left and far right terrorists you got in, say, Italy in the 70s and 80s. And basically, what they are about is provoking a chiliastic or apocalyptic conflict. They don't have realistic or concrete political goals. They want to bring about the end of the world, if you will. And that kind of terrorist phenomenon can't be dealt with politically in the way that the first kind does. What you have to do, I'm afraid, is just a lot of very boring grunt work where you identify people who are at risk, and there's a very distinctive psychological profile, and you just have to track as many people as you can, infiltrate groups, turn people, and then send them back in as agents, the kind of stuff that intelligence services are trained and available to do, and you just have to keep on doing that.
Thank you. I'm going to take two more questions from the floor now. There's a hand up and waving at me at the very back. And then there's another one at the back in the middle on this side as well.
Thank you, yes. A lot of the arguments that have been made so far today have been really great in terms of the practical defences of free markets. But in terms of thinking electorally, do you think it's time that we ought to make the moral case for free markets as well? And the reason for this, I think, is because Corbyn at the last election never justified any of his policies by saying it's cost efficient or it's effective from practical or money situations. So his arguments were entirely moral. It was entirely around what he conceived as fairness, what he conceived as equality. So do you think now we have to, certainly on the libertarian right, make the moral case for free markets as opposed to just the practical one, if any of these policies are going to make traction in government?
And just before you answer that question, I'm going to tie that in with a question I have here, which is, why did Jeremy Corbyn do so well in the last election?
Okay. The short answer to your question is yes, absolutely. As to why did Jeremy Corbyn do so well, I think you're quite right. He made a particular moral case. He's also a very good campaigner. He spent his entire political career basically speaking to public meetings, doing campaigning. That's what he does. He's never held, ministerial office or anything. So he's very, very good at that. And he has a kind of I've met him a couple of times, debated with him several times. He's a really nice chap. And he comes across very, very well in face-to-face contact. His sincerity, which I don't doubt for a minute, comes across very well in that connection. And it's worth saying that something has definitely changed in politics at the moment, by the way. One of the basic ideas about politics for 20, maybe even 30 years has been that campaigns don't matter. and that also face-to-face meetings don't matter, and that what really matters is controlling the media access, television, having a very small number of limited numbers of messages, and having lots of money. Well, I think the evidence of both Jeremy Corbyn in the UK in the last election and Donald Trump in the United States is that that is no longer true. If you think back to Donald Trump, he had all these big mass rallies, he wasn't spending any money compared to Hillary Clinton, and people were saying, what is the point of all these mass rallies? They're not doing anything. Similarly, in the last election, Jeremy Corbyn was going around the country speaking to these very excited mass meetings, and people saying, there's no logic to the kind of itinerary he's got. What is this going to do? But it turns out that when you combine traditional old-fashioned mass meetings with Twitter and other social media, you have a very powerful and effective form of political communication. So I think we're actually going back to the kind of political communication that we had in the 19th or early 20th century before television got a grip on our political campaigning, which is a thoroughly good thing in my view. Now, going back to your main question over there, I think it's very important that you make the moral case for a free society and a free economy. And this is what the great past advocates have done. Being from Manchester, I have to mention Richard Cobden and the Anti-Corn Law League in this connection. If you read the great speeches Richard Cobden made advocating free trade, he doesn't talk about comparative advantage or Ricardo. He talks about the moral principle that you should be free to trade with anybody else you wanted without somebody else interfering with you, and about the way in which free trade would promote peace and amity between nations. And I agree completely. Yes, that is the kind of argument that needs to be made. Efficiency is going to get you so far, but it butters no parsnips with a lot of people. That's a kind of secondary argument.
Thank you. And then there was the other person who has the microphone. Yeah.
Hi. In the aftermath of the financial crisis, people have arguably lost a lot of trust in the free market neoliberal consensus. You can see that in today's politics with the Labour Party veering off into a far left direction and the Conservative Party, to a certain extent, moving away from the kind of IEA tradition that they were traditionally associated with. How do you think that the IEA and other organisations can win back people's trust in the neoliberal consensus, which for about 20 years after Thatcher, the public maintained a trust in that sort of consensus? How do you think we can win it back?
That's a very good question. And I think there are two kind of, my sort of immediate response is that I think there are two things that we can do. The first is to reiterate and, in fact, develop, if you like, the kind of points I made in my very first answer, which is that what we're seeing at the moment, what we saw in acute form in 2008 and its aftermath, but are still living through, if you will, is the long-run effect of essentially trying to have more rapid rates of growth than the world's economies could naturally sustain through really aggressive expansionist monetary policy, which has seriously corrupted the way the market economy works in all sorts of ways, not least through, to be technical about it, through something called Cantillon effects, which is where when new money is created, it seriously distorts relative prices, and this has all kinds of very bad effects on investment markets and the like. And so I think the point to reiterate all the time is that, in fact, there's a radical free market response to the events of the financial crisis, which explains both why it happens and what we should do in response, which was not taken. The other thing to do, I think, is to make the point that really, I think austerity, which I think it's fair to say the British public has lost patience with, is really not the way to go. Because what that implies is that you have a very large government, but you prune it back a lot. And that's not really, I think, ultimately a coherent or defensible position. What you have to do is to make the case that you want to have more things done through voluntary action and less things done through the political process. That is a much more difficult case to make. But I think it's the more intellectually honest and coherent case to make, basically, that what you want to do is to reduce the scope of politics. And the point is actually that the time to make that case is when things are apparently going very, very well, because that's when it's easiest to make it. But that's not where we are. But I think it's still the case. That's what we need to do now.
Okay, why is the record of economic forecasting so poor, given the high levels of economic modelling available to economists?
Oh, that's a really good question. One of the things that is very entertaining, and I recommend you all do it, is to go and look at what the economic forecasters said in the past, and then to look forward like a year or 2 years later and see how accurate they were. And what you will discover is that actually you would do better if you just basically done things at random. Their record is simply abysmal. There was a famous experiment done a few years ago where they got somebody who had an economic model which was used to predict stock market picks, somebody who did stock market picks on the basis of astrology, and a 4-year-old girl. And the way they did with the 4-year-old girl was they gave her a lot of cards with stocks, names on them, and they basically flung the cards up in the air and she picked some of them out at random, and they were the stocks they invested in. I think you know what the answer to this one was. The little girl significantly outperformed both of the other two people. But the really shocking thing is that the person who used astrology did significantly better than the person with the mathematical model. Now, what I think this tells us is that basically the world is much more random, much more chaotic, much more disorderly than we realize. We tend to underestimate this because retrospectively, as we look at the past, as we move away from it, we impose a kind of pattern or structure on it, which actually wasn't there when those events were happening. And so the ability to forecast and foretell the future is actually much, much more limited than most people realize. But of course, people, particularly investors, don't want to hear this. They want to know that there's some way in which they can beat the market, which is almost impossible. And so there's a huge market for economic forecasting. And the only reason why these guys still earn large amounts of money is because nobody does the exercise that I just described to you, where you go and look at what they predicted 3 years ago and find out how well those predictions worked out. Because the answer almost always is really badly. So we just should be really much more cautious about predicting the future and much more humble about our ability to know really what is going on in a large, complex society.
Thank you. And I think this is going to have to be our last question, I'm afraid. But thank you so much to everyone for submitting such brilliant questions and for raising so many hands. I'm sorry we haven't got round to all of you. But how much do you agree with Tyler Cowen's thesis of a great stagnation? And what are the most promising ways of dealing with it? If you could just give a brief overview
of what Tyler says here. Okay, but furthermore, by the way, I'll answer all the questions that I haven't. I'll send email replies to all the people whose questions I haven't had a chance to address. So that doesn't mean you missed out. Now, I should explain, Tyler Cowen, an economist at George Mason University, who I know quite well personally, published a little e-book a few years ago called The Great Stagnation. And Tyler's argument essentially is that in the late 19th and early 20th century, we had a wave of innovations, the internal combustion engine, electricity, domestic appliances, this kind of thing, which radically transformed people's lives, and which also enormously increased productivity. And the way he puts it is that they picked a lot of low-hanging fruit. A lot of things were done at that time which raised productivity very, very significantly, but it was quite easy to do it. Now, Tyler argues that this, and he's not the only one making this case, a number of people have made this case. His argument is that the tide of innovation has slowed, that actually contrary to what people often believe, we are actually in an age of less innovation than before. And the argument is that innovation really peaked about 1920. And also that the innovations we are getting, the kind of ones that Jared talked about, are innovations that basically make our life nicer or more pleasant, but they're not productivity enhancing. So he says, we are in a world where for quite a prolonged period of time, we're going to have relatively low rates of economic growth, at least in the developed countries. Maybe not in developing countries because they have catch-up growth, Geschenker effect growth, where they basically start from a very low point and grow very rapidly for a while. Now, when Tyler first put this forward, I was a skeptic, but I'm increasingly coming round to the view that his diagnosis is probably correct, but not for the reason that he gives. I think that actually we are still having genuine innovation, and I think that a lot of the innovations that are going to have a huge effect are just coming through at the moment, and I alluded to some of them earlier on in my opening remarks. The problem is that many of these are going to actually not show up in GDP statistics, as I said a while ago. A lot of the things that Jared Meyer was talking about are not going to show up in GDP statistics. They may even actually lead to a decline in recorded GDP. So it may well be that we're still having an increase in human well-being, but it's not taking the form of an increase in economic activity. I'm fine with that myself, but that means the stats won't be real. But I do think also that we're facing a number of structural supply-side constraints in the world economy, particularly in the supply of energy. And what these do is to make sustained economic growth in developed economies much more difficult to achieve at the moment. So I think that right now in the British economy, I think it's pretty hard to get the British economy to grow at more than about 1% per annum. Now, I don't think this is going to last, however. Because I think as those innovations I mentioned come through in the next decade or so, you are going to start to see a return to much higher rates of growth. Plus, some of the supply side constraints are ones that you can deal with through various kinds of supply side reforms. But I do think that the next 5 to 10 years are going to be years of generally lower growth in most of the world's developed economies. Not so much in parts of the world like sub-Saharan Africa, which is where I think the really rapid growth is going to be taking place, or China, the Far East, Indian subcontinent, South Asia.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Steve, and thank you to all of you for asking such brilliant questions. We now have a quick break, and then can you all make sure you're back here by past? During the break, Jared will be signing copies of his book, and that will be in the far room where you had some lunch. So see you back here soon. Thank you.